Clostridium difficile, or C.Diff, is a bacterial infection that usually causes diarrhoea. Can also cause things like abdominal pain and fever. People who've had antibiotics are much more vulnerable to getting C. diff. The good bacteria in our gut actually protect us from infections like C. diff, and if you have antibiotics, that can destroy some of the bacteria that normally live in our gut and give us this protective effect. We do know that about 2% of the population will carry C. diff in their gut but not have any symptoms, and then what we think happens is that when they have antibiotics, the C. diff is then able to proliferate in their gut and cause a problem for them.
We were aware that there was a high level of C. diff for a few days prior to the ward closure. Unfortunately, it wasn't improving despite all the actions that we were taking. The situation was worsening and the decision was made to close the ward. My own first personal feeling was absolute devastation. The fact that we had, to all intents and purposes, failed our patients by them developing C. diff. And then it's the thought of how to support the team that works so hard to provide high quality care. We still had patients to care for, we had relatives to try and reassure and support through the process of an isolation closure on the ward. It was just a very, very demoralising time for all.
Well, I was diagnosed with bowel cancer about March, April time, and I was called in for the operation at the end of June. I went into the Anderson wing, which was relatively new then. It had been open for about 10 days, I believe. And after about 2 or 3 days, I found that in the evenings, the pouch which I'd got, which was an extended pouch to take the waste away, was filling up. And for 2 or 3 days I was being violently sick in the evenings. It was absolutely ghastly. And then suddenly they came and said, we've got to take you out of here because you've got C. diff. They took me then to Framingham ward. From there I found that the service in some respects started going downhill because of the numbers that the staff had got. They just weren't able to cope with the needs of everybody as and when the needs arose, and I think this was the most difficult part of that stay.
I think they should be a bit more attentive to somebody when they first get a bag to make sure that it's being emptied more regular, especially over the night time. I think there was a leak somewhere, but if so, they should have made sure that was cleaned a bit more regularly, I think.
The physical symptoms of Clostridium difficile can be very worrying for patients, and often it affects people who are already quite unwell or frail. With Clostridium difficile, people can get diarrhoea. Sometimes they feel a bit sick. They lose their appetite and can lose weight very rapidly, which again can be very worrying.
It was a very, very busy time. We had to explain to the patients why we were closing the ward. We had to phone relatives and explain to them that they would not be able to visit. There were a lot of very anxious relatives who obviously needed further information.
On several occasions we've had incidents where relatives have been very, very upset and angry, but obviously you need to address that as best as possible.
I don't think I got any support. I just went and saw him for half an hour each day. He just told me what was happening and that was all. No, I didn't get much communication at all from the hospital.
You may have a palliatively ill patient who's very, very sort of terminal, and they want every moment they can spend with their relative. But at the same point, we're thinking of a ward environment of several people and trying to make sure that they can see them when it's safe to do so. And relatives don't always understand that fully, and that can be very difficult and challenging sometimes. We're seen as being the enemy, where we're trying to really sort of promote the safest and the best approach to resolve the problem.
We had one particular lady who was terminally ill, and whilst we did allow some very restricted visiting to her next of kin, that lady returned after her mother had passed away to actually thank us for the caring way in which we dealt with that. But it's how to balance everything to protect your patients the best you can, protect your relatives, and also provide your patients with the contact that they do need.
Whenever there is an incident of C. diff, obviously lots of problems can occur with the sense that if a ward was to shut down, you're then limited to the number of beds you have. That's a massive impact on a hospital. And from the individual ward's point of view, they're standing out like a sore thumb because they can be seen, they're the ward that's closed, everybody knows about that. We're all aware of how this looks and how it appears. So morale on a general basis is affected, and all levels of the hospital are affected by this. It is frustrating and embarrassing. The ward procedure is thrown out totally, and you might not have dropped standards in what you're doing. You feel as though maybe you've let yourself down or let the ward down.
There were members of staff that were extremely supportive from outside the ward, but there were some that made comments that made you feel very inferior, very insecure, and as if you were incompetent, which as a team we all knew we weren't. They were circumstances that were outside of our control, which was borne out later in the investigation about the fact that we actually did have some very good practice. It was a series of other issues that led to a combined outbreak. We've learnt from that. The whole trust has learnt from it because everybody was very open, very honest with how we work, and a lot of what we've put in place at that time has been taken out trust-wide, and even some things have been taken nationally, and as we've seen, it's had a marvellous effect on how we deal with C. diff. So we've got something to be very proud of now. At the time we didn't feel very proud, but we do now.
One patient described me feeling emotionally traumatised by C. diff, and he said that he became very emotional on the ward and cried, which was very unlike him and really affected the way he felt he was treated, and affected his perception of the dignity of his dignity. People describe being emotionally drained. They can become quite withdrawn and depressed, and this can be very difficult for the patients and for their relatives to cope with when they're in hospital.
In fact, when I came home, not having shaved for 2 weeks, not having had a reasonable wash of any description, teeth tasting, well, you must realise what it tastes, and having lost 2.5 stone. And that was the worst experience of it all. To my second experience with the C. diff, I found myself again going into the Garrett Anderson ward. Having had the reversal, I had the freedom of movement, so my regime of cleanliness and personal comfort I was able to maintain. So the situation was absolutely reversed. Not only that, I was the only one in the ward, so, you know, the nurses, they were able to give me not only the attention medically which I required, which was minimal, they were able to socialise with me, which was wonderful.
Staff-wise, we've got a very, very strong team. We work extremely well together. We thought we worked well together before, but this has really pulled us together as a team. And it's borne out by the reduction in the C. diff that we've seen, and long may it last. It's not an experience I would ever, ever wish to go through again. We've learnt from it, we've moved on from it, but it's been a very, very tough time.
It isn't an experience I'd wish on my worst enemy, to be honest. Not because it's cancer I had, but the C. diff itself, however it's acquired, it's an awful experience to go through. But I think the quality of nursing and care I received made it far easier for me to handle it.